So my kids were kidnapped on August 10th, 2018, which is going to be 3 years next month.
And when was the last contact you had exactly? What was the last time you saw your kids?
The day before.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about legal means? What legal means?
I've tried everything in Japan. So I filed a case for a return order. I still have custody. I have full custody rights to this day. But I'm being refused access by my wife. To this day, I don't even know whether they're alive or not, as a matter of fact. I tried to go to the police to claim child abduction 4 times. The police told me that because it was the mother, it was not a child abduction, and to which I replied that I would hire a PI and look for them. And once I found them, I would bring them home myself. And then they threatened me of arrest and child abduction attempts, which is in a sense what happened to that Australian father Scott last year, and he spent 45 days in jail. So the threats are real. And the French government has requested, they've got in touch with my wife and they've asked them to go and visit the children to merely assert of their well-being, to which she said no. They've escalated that to the Ministry of Justice on multiple occasions, and unfortunately the Ministry of Justice refused to answer, which is a diplomatic issue. So I myself took the case to the United Nations. So I organized with the help of our lawyer in France, Jessica Finel, we organized a class action against the state of Japan for gross violation of human rights. And the team was composed of 10 parents, mothers and fathers from 4 different countries, Japan, Italy, France and the US, that dealt with both international and domestic abductions. And the case is being reviewed. I presented in front of the European Parliament last year, and a petition was signed, and in these terms asking Japan to stop kidnapping European children, which is pretty strong when you think about it. And the day after, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Motegi, organized the presser saying that the accusation of the European Parliament were groundless, which is the proof that the Japanese really don't want to deal with the issue. And going back, I met with French President Emmanuel Macron in June of 2019. I explained him my situation. He called it unacceptable and said that he would do everything he can, to help us. And he pleaded the case of my children and others to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe that night. And Shinzo Abe said that there was nothing he could do. So, once you've gone to your head of state, who went to the Japanese head of state, and he refuses any sort of cooperation, there's very little that you can do.
What does your lawyer say? I mean, I know you've been through the legal process, but if you're 100% in the right, as most people think you are, what does he say? What's his last word?
So they said that I can now try a process to start the process to ask for visitation, a formal process, which I refused to do at the beginning because I still have parental rights and my children were kidnapped, so I don't see why I would have to ask permission to my wife formally to see the kids. This is an insane concept, and this is also how the Japanese courts trick you, so that the parents who abduct the children becomes the de facto overnight, without any ruling, the custodian of the children, and your only hope is to have them to accept a mere visitation, and I refuse that. My children have been abducted, they have to return home. So I can do that, but I've spoke to to many parents. As a matter of fact, that many of them here who have a visitation right, who hasn't been respected for years. It's because there's no enforcement mechanism in Japan, and no penalty for not respecting any court order. This is crazy.
Diplomacy is basically useless in most cases.
Yeah, absolutely, and Japan really behaves like a country that's not part of the G7 or G20. It is not a democracy by any measures. It has a poor human rights track record, which is funny because they're looking at punishing China for the Uyghur and the situation in Hong Kong, which has to be, but coming from a country that does not respect human rights, it's very hypocrite. And the rule of law in Japan is not respected. They don't respect international treaties. Japan goes and signs United Nations treaties, does not sign protocols that would allow an action against Japan should they not respect the treaty itself, which really shows that they don't really want to have it enforced, and also they don't. How would you say? They don't change their internal law according to the treaties that they ratify, and international laws should dominate domestic laws, but they don't care.
The other factor about diplomacy, I mean, Emmanuel Macron should do something, right?
Well,
What would you?
I mean, Emmanuel Macron is. I mean, I was frankly, when I met the President Macron, I was touched. I thought he had empathy, and I really thought it was an inflection point in the battle to bring my children home. He has tried with the soft diplomacy. He's a politician, and because there's no consequences to the lack of more action from France, he doesn't feel compelled to do more, and they could have done more. So, and that's really the reason I'm doing this action, is to say, look, we've tried soft diplomacy, that has clearly not worked. I mean, the Japanese are not even responding to your request to locate, children on Japanese soil, which is it's never been heard of really in a G7 country. So now it's time to speed up a bit more, and we should end the soft diplomacy and start sanction. And that's exactly what I'm asking. And I'm telling him, either you bring my children back here at the stadium to me, or at least apply some sanction to show that you're being real about defending the interests of French children. And he has an arsenal of options at his disposal. For example, he could recall the French ambassador to Paris. This is what he's done it 2 times in his current mandate. He did it in 2017 or 18 with the French ambassador to Italy, after Salvini said bad things about Macron and his handling of the yellow jacket. So if you can recall an ambassador because of your ego, you can surely recall him because of dozens of French children abducted in Japan. He can ask the Japanese ambassador to leave the French territory as well. He can ask the suspension of the strategic partnership agreement ratified between Europe and Japan. That's which actually the main objective of that treaty agreement is the respect of the rule of law, human rights, and international treaties. So this is the perfect tool to be used to put pressure on Japan to come to the negotiation table. And finally, I think he has to bring the case to the International Court of Justice. And I'll give you an example. Japan is the second largest trading partner for Australia, and in 2010 Australia took Japan to the ICJ for the whaling in Antarctica. So if Australia is willing to do that for the whales, surely France should be able to do it for his children.
And the other point is, if a Japanese person kidnaps somebody, a French person from France, he'd go nuts, right?
In this case, you talk about the Hague Convention, which Japan says it respects, which it doesn't really, because it really plays with loopholes in it. It's not really respecting it in good faith by any measure. But in this case, normally the child should be returned to France under the Hague. But Japan does not return children. It is not true. And I'll give you an example of the Japanese bad faith, is that in the Hague Convention states that once a child has been abducted to another country, the child must be returned within 6 weeks. And the reason for that is to avoid parental alienation, which can take place very, very quickly. But Japan, the average time for a child to be heard by a judge in case of an abduction from overseas is 9 months. So 9 months is long enough for the child to be abducted. And if the child has been abducted to another country where they speak a different language, where he hasn't had any contact with his left behind parents, do you think that 9 months later he's going to tell the judge in front of the mom that he wants to go back to dad? I mean, of course not. And that's why it's important so the statistics that the Japanese will give you in terms of the Hague Convention, on paper look great, or acceptable, I would say. But if you dig into the numbers and you actually look at the number of kids who have been returned within 6 weeks according to Hague principles, it doesn't look good at all. What I find very hypocritical is, there are Japanese abductees to North Korea, right? And it's called lachi. They have a special Japanese word for that. So there are 3 Japanese words for kidnapping. The first one is called tsuresari, which is translating as to take away, because it sounds kawaii. And that's the one that they use for parental abduction, and that's how they get around the criminal act and even the non-respect of international conventions by saying it's not a kidnapping, it's really taking away. The other word is yukai, which is kidnapping, by a third person, and the third one is lachi, which covers the Japanese abductees by North Korea. And on my flag here, you can see that I'm using the kanji lachi. And the reason I'm doing that is that if you go to the website, the Japanese website run by the government, called lachi.co.jp, the Japanese government states that it's a terrible experience for the children to be kidnapped and to never see their family again. It's traumatic for the family to lose a child, so on and so forth. But they're basically describing what we here are going through on a daily basis because of the abduction of our children by a Japanese person.
And what about the support of Japanese people? Because I mean, this problem is mainly a Japanese problem, right? 150,000.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right.
Well, what kind of support have you got?
Yeah, so I think I'm part of the 5% that makes up the gaijin to Japanese abduction. The Japanese are not really by nature fighting back. They're afraid, and when I talk to, there are tons of parents here today, but when I talk to most of them, they don't want to be public about their fight. They're in fear of how people are going to look at them, because there's a stigma that there's a reason why their children have been abducted. They don't want their company to know about it because they're ashamed, and the company could be taking that into account in the review and the compensation. And they don't really know how to fight back. I mean, the movement has really started 2 to 3 years ago, and I'm really happy to start seeing people organizing protests. There are street protests every week now across Japan, by NGOs like Sakura no Kai, so on and so forth, and that's good to see. But it's not enough. You have to lobby your government. You have to, but I also feel for the Japanese, because you're in a country. Japan is not a democracy; it's a dictatorship, and the system is so flawed that you can be in the right. It doesn't matter. So you can do as much lobby as you want. It's not, because the thing is that it's not about the law in Japan. It's actually the application of the law. The law here, by having signed the Convention on the Right of the Child, the best interest of our child should be respected, really, but they don't apply it. And to give you an example, on November 21st of 2019, the Japanese ambassador to the United Nations claimed publicly that to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the ratification of the Convention on the Right of the Child by Japan, they were pledging to fulfill its obligations. When I read that, I was over the moon. The day after, a high court ruling in Japan ruled that the treaties, and especially the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was not binding in Japan. And that shows that they go and sign treaties protected by the Japanese constitution, but when it comes to judges to apply it, it gets totally ignored. So the law is sufficient, and the issue is not there. The issue is about people applying the law. The kidnapping of a child is covered under Article 224 of the Penal Code. It's an abduction of a minor, so it doesn't specify or exclude even that if a parent abducts a child, it's not an abduction. So I went to the police 4 times, and they refused to take that into account because the abductor was my wife. And when I told them that I would bring them back, by the same token, they threatened me of arrest on child kidnapping charge. So, the rule of law does not exist, and when a country does not respect the rule of law, they are not a democracy, they are not a developed country.